Chapter 909. Above the sea, not long after the sword immortals joined forces to drag the moon, a mountain ferry hovered in the air. Nearby, there were two greatly sword boats escorting it. It was huge and covered the sky. It floated above Osmanthus Island. All the immortal ferries in the Aquarius continent had been requisitioned by the Confucian Temple and the Dali Imperial Court. Osmanthus Island, which belonged to the Fan family in Old Dragon City, was no exception. However, not long after the meeting in the Confucian Temple ended, the Fu family in Old Dragon City rented a new ferry from the Baijin continent and the Liuxia continent to maintain the trade routes. Although this kind of thing was considered opportunistic, it was allowed by the Confucian Temple in the central region, so it was not against the rules. Therefore, the few immortals who could build cross-continent ferries on their own made a lot of money. Chapter 910. Luo Pa Mountain, the Mountain Gate. Chun Lingjun looked around, and while there was no one else, he secretly took out a bottle of wine, and with a twist of his wrist, two wine bowls appeared, and he threw them to the new gatekeeper across the table. A little boy in green and a young Taoist sat opposite each other. One stepped on the bench, the other took off his boots, and sat cross-legged. Chun Lingjun leaned forward, extended his arm, and bumped into the young Taoist. The latter drank a big mouthful of wine, and laughed. "I'm fine with it." Chapter 911. Uploaded late. Ascension City. Business was good today. Two batches of customers came one after another. Just as Fan Dash and Wang Xinshui took their seats, Sita Longqiu and Luo Zhini came along with a few women. Zheng Dafeng did not even need to give him a look. Fan Dash and the rest took the initiative to give up their seats at the last table and went to the roadside to drink. They wanted to listen to stories about immortals fighting and bedwalking with their brother Dafeng. Unexpectedly, Zheng Dafeng had already sat down at the table. Chapter 912. When the three of them left Wukue City, whistles could be heard from the top of the city wall. So, what if Ning Yao was there? There was still the second shopkeeper. In the Great Wall of Sword Aura, everyone knew that Ning Yao still respected the second shopkeeper outside the Ning Mansion. As for whether the second shopkeeper would kneel on the washboard when they returned to the Ning Mansion, it was none of their business. On the way, Chun Pingon smiled and said, "Let's go to the Fu Xian Lake first." There were two immortal ferries in the Ascension City. The northernmost one was the Summer Ferry in the Summer City. The other one was at the foot of the Purple Mansion Mountain where Deng Liang cultivated. There was a ferry built on the Fu Xian Lake and named it the Lost Soul Ferry. One was in the north and the other was in the south. Chapter 913. Early in the morning, Chun Pingon reached for the jade token of the hidden official in his sleeve. With a single step, he arrived at the steps outside the Summer Palace. It was different from the Summer Palace, which had its doors closed all day long. It was more like a government office. Unlike the vassal cities, there were no gatekeepers. It was not a hindrance to visit, but it was fine as long as one did not wander around. If one had something to say, they would say it and leave as soon as they were done. It was impossible to get the hidden official's line of sword cultivators to serve wine to guests. In the early days of the Summer Palace, other than the eldest sword immortal, even Qin Shi and Qi Tingji could not step through the doors. Before Ning Yao landed in Ascension City and took over the position of hidden official, she had never set foot in the Summer Palace. Chapter 914. The Quan Residence. Chun Pingon brought Xiao and Mo through the corridors to pay a visit to Lord Gaoyi. Lord Gaoyi stood at the door to welcome them, joking, "How does it feel to tour your own territory? Not bad, right?" Nowadays in Ascension City, who doesn't know that the place with the most supporters of hidden official Chun Pingon isn't even the Summer Palace where there are few sword cultivators, but this Quan residence which is famous for its reputation. There was once a young sword cultivator who tried to steal couplets but failed, and directly said. Chapter 915. Yang Ningxing, whose neck was being strangled, blushed. He could only hit the arm of the person behind him with all his might, hoping that the other party would be merciful. They were all strangers. There was no need to fight. The young man in white seemed to be very angry. Not only did he not loosen his arm, but he also took a step forward and pulled Brother Mu Mao so hard that his back was almost level with the ground. Yang Ningxing was really dizzy. He said with difficulty, "Good brother, discipline him, discipline him. Don't leave him in the lurch. This student of yours is born with great strength. He is too heavy-handed. He could only see a young man with a red mole in between his eyebrows. His face was full of killing intent." The young man in white turned to look at Zheng Dafeng. He bent his knees and squatted. First, he twisted his arms so hard that Yang Ningxing rolled his eyes. He did not care whether he was dead or alive. He just smiled brightly and said, "Brother Dafeng." Zheng Dafeng smiled and said, "It has been many years since we last met. Brother Cui is still a handsome young man." Chapter 9:16. Chen Pingon stood up alone and strolled along the fields. An old friend had come. It was Qi Shou, who had rushed over from Wukue City. He was the current leader of the criminal officers. Qi Shou went straight to the point. "If you didn't come to the spring residence to find me, I would have been worried. Why don't you take the initiative to come and get scolded?" Who didn't know that the young hidden official of the Summer Refuge Palace was full of strange words? It was as if he had a large basket of natal flying swords, each one of them stabbing at the heart. Chen Pingon smiled. "Brother Qi and I are close friends. Now that Brother Qi has been promoted again, I can't wait to flatter you. How would I dare to criticize a newly promoted criminal officer?" The two of them walked side by side on the fields. Qi Shou said, "I heard that the previous criminal officer is called Hao Su. When Ning Yao returned to Ascension City last time, she didn't tell me the details of your trip to the wilderness. So much so that I only know his name now." Chapter 9:17. After Lu Chen left the cooling sect of the North Continent, he did not return to the Baek Okekyung building immediately. Instead, he went to the Artemisia Kingdom and met the scholar with the surname Chen at the Dongxian Street. Then, he sneaked back to the Aquarius continent to meet an old friend who was of a higher level than him but whose identity could not be underestimated. After crossing the sea from the North Continent and heading south, he reached the skies above the Aquarius continent. As expected, the sage of the Confucian Temple, who was in charge of the sky canopy, chatted with Lu Chen for a while. Lu Chen felt that the conversation was short and affectionate, but it was a pleasant one. As for what the other party thought, Lu Chen did not care. In the Yuzhong County of Hong Province, there was a newly established Sefu Institute. The first chief official of the Sefu Institute was a person from the capital named Lin Zhengcheng. Chapter 9:18. In Dexiandu Temple there was a stream in the peach forest. The water was so clear that one could see the bottom. A tall old Taoist priest and a young fat man were sitting on small stools. They had their pants rolled up and were barefoot in the stream. One of them was drinking wine, while the other was holding a large handful of freshly picked lotus seeds. Fatty Yen asked, "Old son, why did you lend the sword to Bai Yi?" Aoyang said that sword cultivators like us need a long sword to rely on the heavens for thousands of miles. How could someone like you give away such an immortal sword? Now look, I heard that there are many immortals in White Jade Capital who don't respect you, Old Sunday. They said that your relationship with our Xuandu temple is like that of a withered tree. Listen, how infuriating. When Dong Huafu talked to me about this, I was so angry that I almost went to White Jade Capital with him. I wanted to get back at them for you, Old Sunday. Unfortunately, my cultivation level is too low now. I'm afraid that I won't succeed in the Q-sword seeking and will instead embarrass the Xuandu temple. The old temple master, as the leader of the Sword Celestial sect, had the same level of swordsmanship as Taoism. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to sit on the 5th in the world seat. Priest's son sneered, "Just say it. I don't like to beat around the bush." Chapter 9:19. At the sky canopy in the center of the five-colored world, 2 streaks of sword radiance rose from the Ascension City and soared into the clouds. Between the heaven and the earth, the clouds were stirred up by the sword aura and huge whirlpools were formed. The bright sword radiance drew an arc between the clouds and the soil. When it was about the same height as the sky canopy door, the sword radiance suddenly stopped tens of thousands of miles away. In an instant, two figures appeared. One wore a jade hairpin and wore a green robe. The other wore a yellow hat and green shoes and held a mountain staff. The two sword cultivators each turned into a dozen streaks of sword radiance and rushed towards the door. They were using the same escape technique. Their speed was even faster than the drifting cloud boat. A lean old man in a Confucian robe stroked his beard and smiled. I have to admit that sword cultivators are more carefree when it comes to traveling. Their sword radiance flashes, and they are as fast as lightning. They are not restrained by the heavens and the earth. Just looking at them gives people a feeling of straightforwardness. Chapter 9:20. Chen Pingon accompanied Xiaomi on her inspection of the ferry when two managers of the ferry approached them. Because she had to participate in the sex celebration, she was temporarily in charge of the wind kite ferry. She slowly walked over and stopped. Her bearing was graceful as she bowed to Chen Pingon. "Greetings, sir." As the second manager of the ferry appointed by the young mountain master, old immortal Jia cleaned himself up from head to toe. His appearance was thin, and his hair was white as snow. He looked more and more like an otherworldly expert. The old immortal had brought out his best attire. He was wearing a Taoist robe and a pair of cloud-stepping shoes. There was a small jade chime on his waist. This was a spiritual tool that the blind old Taoist had bought from a straw shop in Dragon Riding Alley in his early years. The design on the jade chime was simple and unadorned. There was a line of small characters carved on it. "Heavenly wind blows the chime. I recite the yellow chord. The sound of gold and jade vibrates. The heavens respect each other." Jia Qing stood beside Chong Ming. His position was slightly behind Chen Pingon. He greeted Chen Pingon and said respectfully, "Greetings, Hill Master." As for the pair of lotus silk cloud-stepping shoes on the old immortal's feet, it was one of the gifts from Mr. Xiao Mo. Chapter 9:21. Elder Changming dragged Xiaomi along for a stroll. Chen Pingon strolled with Jia Cheng and asked with a smile, "Are you used to your current identity?" Jia Cheng immediately clasped his hands and said emotionally, "Thanks to Mountain Lord's high regard, I was able to hold an important position. I can't slack off, but I don't dare to do anything unnecessary. After thinking about it, I can only adhere to one principle: see more, smile more, speak less, act less, and show less. My cultivation is shallow to begin with. I'm just in the Dragon Gate realm. Forget about helping Feng Yuan Fairy in its hour of need. I might not even be able to do the icing on the cake. I just thought that I wouldn't delay things and would take one step at a time. I would try my best to do my best for Luopa Mountain. I can't let down the Mountain Master's high hopes." Luopa Mountain's Zhang Changming and God of Fortune Wei Wenlong were temporary helpers on Wind Kite Ferry. They would return to Luopa Mountain after the sex celebration. According to Cui Dongshan's arrangement, the people in charge of the ferry were Jia Cheng and Zhang Jiazhen, who were in charge of receiving people. Chapter 9:22. The chapter was uploaded late. Sorry. Just as Xiao Mo was about to draw his sword, a faint voice sounded between heaven and earth, like rustling leaves falling, revealing a strong sense of loneliness. "It's really you." Xiao Mo waited quietly for the next sentence. After a while, the voice sounded again, "You all go back. It's useless to meet." Xiao Mo sneered, and he no longer talked nonsense with the fellow who he had only met a few times. He walked forward slowly and raised the long sword in his hand. "Mister, just follow me. In at most 15 minutes, you can see the other party's real body." Xiao Mo first nailed a long sword into the ground, and the entire empty and lonely world changed color. It was like a picture scroll, but because of the long time, it appeared yellow. Chapter 9:23. The Wind Kite Ferry was already close to the celestial capital mountain. As expected, the celestial with the title Dragon Gate of the Steel Tree Mountain had explored the surrounding mountains and rivers for thousands of miles. Everywhere, there were broken walls and dilapidated scenes. Yu Feng returned to the secret snow peak and saw the disciple chatting with Zheng Yuqian on the railing of a viewing platform. It was probably because of the old saying of women being more outgoing. Tanning Zhou was saying to Zheng Yuqian, "You can't do anything, but you can look for junior martial uncle more than anyone else." As expected, those few senior martial brothers and sisters, including himself, were the senior martial uncles of many steel tree mountain cultivators. Chapter 924. The chapter was uploaded late. Sorry. The clouds were burning in the sky, and the sunset stretched for thousands of miles. A dragon boat named Overturned Ink docked at an immortal ferry. A group of people was preparing to change to the ferry and head to the kingdom of Huangliang. The leader of the group was a little boy in green clothes who swaggered off the boat. His two sleeves were flapping in the air. Beside him was a young girl with a hand-copied inkstone hanging from her waist and a green bamboo cane in her hand. Behind him was a young man in a scholarly robe and a yellow-clothed old man who looked like a retainer. His appearance was strange, and he had eagle eyes. Because he was skinny, he looked like he was wearing an extremely loose robe. Chapter 925. Qing Tong, whose sleeves were dragging on the ground, seemed to be instantly shattered by a punch, and his body suddenly split into two. Qing Tong was no longer in the posture of immortality, with extremely long sleeves and ethereal qi. A yang spirit body appeared on the spot. It was an old man with a burly figure, muscular arms, and snow-white hair. He stood barefoot. The old man showed a slightly surprised expression. His feet on the smooth mirror-like ground, he stepped straight back for more than 100 feet before he stopped and shook his wrist. Just this ordinary subtle movement was like a dragon shaking its scales. His fist intent flowed like a river, and it showed a kind of golden phenomenon visible to the naked eye. The fist aura was as thick as water, shining brightly. This old martial artist who claimed to be half a god was like an immortal god standing in the smoke of incense. Qing Tong, who had tempered his body to the extreme, seemed to be quite surprised at the moment. A pure martial artist who was only at the first level of Qi Flourishing Realm, especially a 10th level martial artist who had fallen from the first level of the pure realm, had such great strength. Chapter 926. Before he received the punch, an ancient armor suddenly appeared on Qing Tong's yang spirit body. This punch was too strange. Since he could not defeat it, and at the same time, he was destined to be unable to avoid it, Qing Tong could only choose to take it head-on. Outside of the snow-white robe, he added another set of armor to protect his body. It was obvious that Qing Tong did not think that he could take the punch completely without relying on external objects with his half-godly martial body. After the punch, the armor on the white-haired old man's body shattered like a mirror and shot out like countless shooting stars. Moreover, the old man's burly figure began to fall to the ground, but it was not a straight line. It was because this world was like a crumpled ball of paper that a child casually grabbed. In this place, the direction of the flow of the river of time had already exceeded the common sense of the world. The so-called directions were all fabricated. North, south, east, west, up, down, left, and right were all twisted and folded. As a result, many seemingly adjacent worlds were thousands of miles away from each other. Many seemingly thousands of miles away were actually only a millimeter or a step away from each other. Chapter 927. Chun Pingon had originally planned on heading straight for the underwater residence of the Duke of Spirit Origin, but he changed his mind at the last moment and decided to go somewhere else. With a single thought, he ignored the distance and stood beneath a wudong tree in the capital of the Great Yuan dynasty. Raising his head and looking into the distance, Qin Pingon took another step and arrived in a black and white imperial palace. He seemed to have entered a realm of no man. This Great Yuan dynasty was founded by Water Da. Last time, Qin Pingon had gone to the Cloud Palace of the Chongxian Bureau to discuss business with the Lu Emperor. At the time, the emperor had only brought a young prince with him. His name was Lu Jun, and he was now the crown prince. Chun Pingon gave Prince Lu Jun a handwritten copy of his teacher's calligraphy as well as a handwritten copy of a fist manual. It was the mountain-quaking fist written by Guyu, the ultimate warrior of the Great Seal dynasty. As for Lu Jun's talent in cultivation and martial arts, it was actually very ordinary. Back then, Chun Pingon had treated him honestly and truthfully, not using those polite words to brush him off. In the end, the two of them became master and disciple in secret. Before daybreak, there was still some time before the morning court. Emperor Liu Yong woke up early and found it difficult to fall asleep. He simply had the eunuchs light the lamps and sat cross-legged on a heated bed in a small warm room. As he read through memorials, he rubbed his forehead. The warm room was paved with earth coils. Even in the depths of winter, it was as warm as spring. Occasionally, the emperor would order the palace to stop burning charcoal. He said that the cold would refine the muscles and bones and strengthen the body. On the other hand, the princes of the Liu family who were studying on the southern veranda of the Wanying Palace would only be given a hand warmer if they encountered a bone-chilling cold that only happened once every few decades. Otherwise, they would have to quietly stomp their feet and shiver while reading loudly. It was just studying. It couldn't be said to be hard work, but it wasn't easy. Chapter 928. Suddenly, Yangji asked in his mind, "Can I talk to that Taoist friend?" Chun Pingon stopped and adjusted his bamboo hat. He seemed to be discussing something with someone. After a short moment, the sound of a camel's bell resounded from afar. The sound of a camel's bell was long and drawn out on an ancient path of yellow sand. A person wearing a hedgerow on his head and a jade-green robe led a white camel over unhurriedly. The sun hung high in the sky and baked the earth. Even the light was distorted. The drinkers who were playing finger-guessing games in the shop all looked away and whispered to each other. They held the camel's arm and revealed a white, lotus-like wrist. They began to guess the woman's age. They wondered what she looked like. They wondered if she was a relative of the wine master. They wondered how old she was, and if she was married. However, it was quickly overshadowed by another strange scene. In the distant sky, there were carriages and horses passing by mountaintops, heading toward the wine shop as fast as lightning. The patrolling formation was very large. There were civil and military officers, goddesses and palace maids, and there were at least 20 people. The ostentation was just like the 8 prefectures in those court cases. They held imperial swords in their hands and beat gongs to clear the way. There were officials carrying 2 placards. The mountain was solemn and the water was still, and strangers should avoid them. The biggest difference was that one was on the ground, and the other was in the sky. Chapter 929. In the center of the Aquarius continent, there was a majestic palace. The Changchun Marquis residence, Bixiao Palace. There were many plaques hanging in the palace. The merit given by the mountain elder of the Lake View Academy was eternal, the poem written by the head of the Yunlin Jiang family, and the divine capital Pinghan from Linlu Academy. Even Lu Qingfeng, the former minister of rites in the capital of the Great Li dynasty, made an exception when he was alive and gave him a piece of calligraphy. It was the 4 words, plowing fields and reading rain, written in an imposing manner. In the Aquarius continent, Yang Hua, who was given a title of Marquis by the Confucian Temple, was the water god head venerable. Chun Pingon did not directly look for Yang Hua. Chapter 930. Sage of Rites drank a bowl of wine in the shop and asked, "What do you mean?" The old scholar laughed so hard that his face was wrinkled. He said, "This is a rare opportunity. Let me take a break and drink a little more. An emperor doesn't need hungry soldiers." The old scholar was in charge of the affairs in the Confucian Temple and the Merit Forest. It was not too much to say that he took a break from the busy work. Sage of Rites hesitated and reminded him, "Remember, don't push your luck. If the Confucian Temple can't do anything to you, I'll go to Chun Pingon." There were very few people who could make Sage of Rites remind them like this. Chapter 931. In a small county in Huangting Country, The name of the county was Suiyin, meaning peace and safety. It belonged to the Yan Province Prefecture, and the Yan Province Prefecture was the place that produced the most number of Zhuangyuan and Jinshi in the Yellow Court Nation. This county didn't have any large residences, but there were many scholarly families. Before Chen Pingon entered the county, he saw a literary tower that stood on top of a small mountain. Since ancient times, places with a flourishing literary culture were like this. One would see the Wenchang Tower before seeing the city. Qing Tong spread out his spiritual sense and looked around the county. It did not seem like a place. With Qing Tong's state and vision, he should have seen some clues. However, there was not even a river granny in the rivers and streams around the county. The Reiki in the county was extremely thin, and the fate of martial arts was even worse. It could be completely ignored. There were signs of literary fate, but it was not a big deal. Most of it was a kind of continuous inheritance under the protection of the ancestors. It came from some imperial plaques and buildings, as well as the plaques in the ancestral halls that hung Jinshi. There were also some in the shabby alleys and poor families. Qing Tong became more and more confused. Could it be that he was blind? Was there a grand cultivator at the top of the mountain or a sage of merit living in seclusion here and deliberately hiding the secret of heaven? Qing Tong could not help but ask, "Who are we looking for this time?" Chapter 932. Chen Pingon didn't step over the threshold into the Hall of Swords. After all, it was the ancestral hall of Ziyang Prefecture. He turned around and said with a smile, "Let's go to the kitchen to broaden our horizons." Inside, there were portraits of the ancestral masters. The one in the middle was Wu Yi wearing a Taoist robe and stepping on clouds. Other than that, the portraits of the past masters were lined up on the left and right. Tomorrow at Celestial Capital Mountain, there would also be a portrait of Chen Pingon hanging in the middle of the ancestral hall of Qingping Sword Sect. When Qing Tong moved, he turned his head and glanced at the inscribed board. Hall of Swords? In the books, generals and chivalrous heroes often had this kind of stretching out their hands and pressing their swords to shout. Chapter 933. Outside the courtyard. Xiao Wan was trembling with fear as she accompanied Wu Yi. She did not know the identity of the green-robed woman. She could not be the legendary female sword immortal Ningyao, right? But the female cultivator in front of her was not carrying a sword or a sword sheath. Furthermore, if she was Ningyao, why would she need to cover her face? The news of Ningyao leaving the Five Colors world and appearing in Dali's capital had already spread out in the mountain and rivers official circles. But the Aquarius continent seemed to have a tacit understanding. No mountain dared to write about this. Chapter 934. At the peak of Northern Peaks Cloud Padding Mountain, an ancient pine tree towered into the sky. A man reclined on a white jade couch beneath it. He held his chin with one hand, as if he was sleeping and smiling. He wore a snow-white robe and a pair of cloud shoes. A ribbon was tied around his waist, and a golden earring hung from his ear. Gods, immortals, ghosts, it was as beautiful as a painting. It was rumored that the 5 mountain lords of the Aquarius continent each had their own style. Chapter 935. Mount Sui in the Central Region. A deity in golden armor holding a sword in both hands opened his eyes slowly on the mountain peak. This deity's real name was Zhouyu, and his godly title was Grand Ritual. He was the most powerful deity in the 9 continents of the world. Zhouyu sized up the green-robed swordsman who was standing thousands of miles away. Chapter 936. Walking out of the river of time, Qing Tong looked around and asked suspiciously, "Why didn't you return to subduing Yao Tower directly? Is there a mountain god from Aquarius continent that you want to meet?" Chen Pingon shook his head and said, "I have never been here before, but someone came up with this idea and asked me to take care of a guest, so I came here to send someone off." Qing Tong was even more puzzled. Who could tell you what to do? Not far away, There was a sparkling place. A pavilion was hidden in the shade of green trees, and a few melodious chimes could be heard from above. Chun Pingon said, "Let's go ahead and wait for them." Chapter 937. At the Fin River Temple, Chun Pingon and Qing Tong were looking at different sceneries. Both of them focused on different sceneries, so they decided to go first. When Qing Tong finished looking around the various halls, he realized that Chun Pingon was no longer in the Hebo Temple. Walking out of the temple, Qing Tong saw a man in a green robe sitting on a small bamboo chair under the shade of the willow beside the big pond. He was casting a fishing rod. Qing Tong walked over and asked, "Are there any more bamboo chairs?" Chun Pingon put his finger to his mouth and signaled Qing Tong to lower his voice. Then, he twisted his wrist and a small bamboo chair appeared. He passed it to Qing Tong. Chapter 938. The old scholar stood at the door and bowed. "Greetings, Sect Master Lu. I am Lu Sheng." Both parties reunited after a long separation. One called the West Continent brother, while the other called himself a junior. As the scholar and the Taoist priest did not use their inner thoughts, the girl heard them clearly. She frowned instantly. "Sect Master Lu? Sect Master?" Could this young Taoist priest who called himself Immortal Technique Body actually be someone from the pugilistic world? Otherwise, who would dare to establish a sect on the mountain? Chapter 939. In the kingdom of Dreamliang, the ancestral mountain of the Yellow Millet sect, which was the neighbor of the Rosy Cloud Mountain, was called Lu Mountain. It was located in Biei district of the Huayan prefecture of the kingdom of Dreamliang. Ever since the Yellow Millet sect bought the clothing belt peak in the mountains to the west of the former location of the Pearl Grotto Heaven as a place to descend, they seem to have gone from having bad luck to having good luck. First, they used a pouch of winter greeting money to buy passage. Then they used the remaining pouch of victory money to buy the clothing belt peak from the Dali Imperial Court. The price had increased by several times. Afterwards, their senior uncle, Lu Hongwen, who was basically sent to the clothing belt peak in the past, got acquainted with the Luopa mountain. It was said that even the mountain lord, Chun Pingon, had to respectfully refer to him as Old Immortal Master Lu. Moreover, their senior uncle and the guardian of the Luopa mountain, Chen Lingjun, were extremely good drinking buddies. Their senior uncle had even attended a few night feasts on the Cloud Draping Mountain, so he had become familiar with Wei Shanjun no matter what. In their senior uncle's words, I, Lu Hongwen, would always sit in the front row at Wei Shanjun's night feasts. When have I not been below nascent soul? My seat was the closest to the front. Of the gods of the mountains and rivers sitting in the row opposite me, 2 of them were the righteous gods of the Embroidery River, and one of them was the Lord City God of the Dragon Province. In the court of the Dali Imperial Court, which one of them was worse? In the kingdom of Dreamliang, even the 5 mountains mountain lord with the highest godhood could sit beside the water god of the Embroidery River. Chapter 940. When the Lu Mountain Ancestral Hall received the paper kite's message, a flying sword was immediately sent to this pavilion. With a flash of sword light, Gao Zhen frowned slightly. He closed his fingers and caught the messenger flying sword. After reading the contents of the letter, he was shocked, stunned, and then delighted. Then, an uncontrollable smile appeared on his face. Huang Tsong didn't ask anything. This time, it was Gao Zhen's turn to hesitate. He smiled and said, Your Majesty, please wait for a moment. We can't wait for a certain message. In any case, Your Majesty didn't lose anything. Just wait. Consider it a return gift from our Yellow Millet sect. Gao Zhen walked out of the pavilion and left directly on his flying sword. Chapter 941. Inside the pavilion, the atmosphere was much more harmonious. When they heard that Taoist Lu from the Autumn Hare Temple was actually a distinguished guest who climbed the mountain with Mountain Lord Chen, they fell silent. Of course, they didn't dare to believe it. However, no matter how unbelievable it was, they had to believe it. After all, who would dare to fake something like this? The female cultivators who were originally lazy all became serious. When they looked at the young Taoist, they felt that he was even more handsome. The young Taoist was like a storyteller at the foot of the mountain as he began to reminisce about the past. Although Mountain Lord Chun and I didn't come from the same hometown, we were friends who went through thick and thin together. If I were to put it in a more elegant way, it would be the first time we met. At that time, Mountain Lord Chun and I had yet to make a name for ourselves. Then, we hit it off and went on a long journey together. We once slept at a Xingwang temple and sleepwalked to the Department of Wealth and Honor, where we met the Judge of Wealth and Honor who wore a purple robe and a jade belt. Chapter 942. What a do as you please. Sure enough, sword cultivators were unrestrained in their actions. Just as Chun Pingon was about to leave the pavilion, Lu Chen smiled and said, "I heard that Qingping's sword sect has a silken mist mountain." Chun Pingon nodded and said, "Celestial Capital Mountain is the main mountain, Silken Mist Mountain and Steaming Cloud Mountain are auxiliary. This is the layout of the three mountains. Since Cui Dongshan is the leader of a lower sect, he naturally has his own plans." According to Cui Dongshan's words, since the world is going to change, one should plan ahead and plan early. Chapter 943. Lu Chen followed him out of the pavilion. The words, 1,000 years, were just dream and awaken. After he walked down the stairs, he turned around and took a look. He didn't know when he would be able to visit this place again. Back then, when you were setting up the fortune-telling stall, did you already know the identity of the old master of our kiln, Old Yao? I wasn't sure about Old Yao's identity back then. I could only guess. Deducing the heavenly secrets in Liju Grotto Heaven is a thankless task. It can easily backfire. Do you think Mr. Qi knew about it? Chapter 944. Returning to the demon-subduing tower in Tongya Continent, Chen Pingon opened his eyes and stood up. Once again, he saw the tall old man. Chen Pingon bowed to him silently. The first time was when he was brought to the peak of Sui Mountain by the teacher. The second time was when Chen Pingon represented all the sword cultivators in the Great Wall of Sword Qi to attend the riverside meeting. Back in his hometown, Chen Pingon only met the Tao ancestor. He did not meet the Holy Master or the Buddha. At Sui Mountain, Chen Pingon met the Holy Master for the first time. After that, the teacher asked him how he felt. There was nothing to hide from the teacher, so Chen Pingon told him the truth. If he met the Holy Master in a Confucian robe in the market, he would suspect that the old man had been in Jianghu when he was young. The old scholar was happy for a long time and said that the evaluation was good, very good. Chapter 945. The Holy Master gazed into the distance and sighed with emotion. What is a hero? There are always a few things that no one else in the world can do that I can. What is a sage? There are always a few things that no one else in the world can do that I can't. Chen Pingon blushed with shame. I'm still far from it.
Lu Meng laughed.
The Holy Master wasn't talking about you. Chapter 946. Pei Qian brought Zheng Yuqian and Tanning Zhou to sit on the steps of Secret Snow Peak. Miyu had finally become a true Great Sword Immortal Me after her seclusion on the Wind Kite Ferry. Calling her Great Sword Immortal Me was already insulting. If she was called Great Sword Immortal Me, it would be like slapping her face. Fortunately, things were different now. The chief consecrator of the Celestial Capital Mountain's Green Duckweed Sword Sect was a fully deserving Great Sword Immortal. Chapter 947. A young Taoist with a lotus crown walked on the highest railing of the Baek Okekyung building. He walked slowly with his hands in his sleeves and his palms folded. He looked down and saw the 5 cities and 12 buildings one by one. there seemed to be some new faces. Lu Chen looked up at the bright moonlight. The immortals sharpened the flying mirror. 2 moons hung in the sky. Looking at the new moon, Lu Chen stopped and turned back. He continued to walk along the railing. Chapter 948. After all, senior brother Yu was still waiting for them at the Baek Okkyung building. Lu Chen was in a hurry, so he used the 3 mountains talisman with Hao Su. The mountains and rivers on the ground meandered like dragons and snakes. It was a beautiful landscape that was completely different from the vast world. The land of the vast 9 prefectures stood like mountains in the 4 seas, while the 14 prefectures of the green underworld seemed to have been separated by those great blasphemies. A dazzling sword light landed on Divine Cloud City. It was the imposing figure of the criminal official, Hao Su. Chapter 949. Li Er brought his wife and daughter and followed his son-in-law, Han Qingjiang, to the Hualing dynasty in the north of the North Continent. This was the first time the 2 families were formally visiting relatives after the marriage. Ever since the woman alighted from a carriage and arrived at her son-in-law's estate in the street called Xiaozi Alley, which was wider than the main street, she started to feel ill at ease before she even stepped over the tall threshold. She didn't even know where to place her hands. Her son-in-law had previously explained the origin of this Xiaozi Alley, such as how Qiao Mu was high above, Zimu Jin was low below, and some other reasoning, but the woman didn't understand, so she didn't take it to heart. However, when she heard that the entire alley belonged to their Han family, and that according to the Han clan's ancestral teachings, they were not allowed to split the family, the woman was left speechless. Wasn't her son-in-law's family too rich? Such a long alley was all surnamed Han? Just a year's worth of food wasn't a small sum, right? Just the large golden plaque at the entrance and the 2 jade white lions that were taller than a person when they squatted were already enough to give the woman a firm show of strength. When they entered the house, they walked around in circles until she was dizzy. Along the way, they didn't even touch chicken or dog feces. She didn't even dare to spit. The woman ruthlessly pinched the man's waist. The man turned his head and grinned. He reached out to hold her hand, but the woman hurriedly slapped his hand away. They were an old married couple, yet they didn't feel ashamed. If the scholars inside saw this and looked down on our YZ, what should we do? The woman could only lightly pinch her arm. It hurt, so she wasn't dreaming. Chapter 950. A thin and weak Taoist priest, wearing a felt hat, a badly sewn green cotton Taoist robe, and a pair of thick cotton shoes, walked on the road like a thin bamboo pole swaying. Beside him was a burly middle-aged man with a knife at his waist. The handle of the knife had been polished until it was shiny. The man had started growing a beard a few months ago, and soon his face was full of whiskers. The 2 of them walked together on the road back to their hometowns. Their hometowns were not far from each other, only 30 to 40 miles away. Both were within the boundaries of Wuling County. In fact, the Taoist priest was more than 20 years younger than the man, but because of his aged appearance, he looked at least 10 years older than the man. The key point was that although this Taoist priest did not have an officially recognized edict, he was a genuine Taoist cultivator. His friends were purely martial artists. Chapter 951. In the backyard of the Yang clan's drugstore, a female martial artist was guarding the empty backyard of the drugstore by herself. Shirling Shan had returned to his home in the Peach Leaf Alley. Su Jian didn't feel lonely or anything. She was used to it since she was young. She felt uncomfortable with so many people around. The pharmacy was a shop in the front and a workshop in the back. The decoction and drying of herbs were all done in the backyard. The main building was Old Yang's residence. The door of the east wing was closed. Usually, Old Man Yang would only open the door when Li Huai returned to his hometown and came here for a stroll. Only the west wing was vacated long ago and given to Su's shop. Chapter 952. The provincial capital of Chu Province and the prefectural capital of Longquan Commandery were in the same city. Naturally, it was more prosperous than Red Candle Town at the confluence of the three rivers. She was a woman who lived in luxury after returning home. After all these years of living like a princess, she had a graceful bearing. If one only looked at her face and disregarded the crow's feet at the corner of her eyes, she would look like she was in her 30s. Praising her as a middle-aged woman would not go against his conscience at all. If one did not know her well, they would have mistaken her for a woman from a wealthy family on Fortune Street. The house was paved with earth, so there was no need for a brazier by her feet. Even the charcoal cage in her hands could be saved. In her early years, when she returned her hometown from Qingxia Island in the book Slip Lake, she directly bought a lot of houses in Zhou City. It turned out that her decision to spend a lot of money back then was not a waste. Instead, she made a lot of money. Just the rent of those shops every year was a large sum of money. Of course, she had long since looked down on gold and silver. Only the money of immortals was money. In these years, the woman had mostly gone to the house in Huaihuang County to pay respects to her ancestors before returning to Mud Bottle Alley to sit for a while. Chapter 953. Qingming Tian, Xiandu Temple. In the peach blossom forest, an old Taoist was walking side by side with a handsome young man wearing a tiger head hat. Behind them was a fat man who was looking around to see if there were any peach branches on the ground. The group of traveling swordsmen from the Great Wall of Sword Aura were staying at the Baek Okekyung Building, Divine Cloud City, and Xiandu Temple. Xiandu Temple was only assigned to the fat man, but the young swordsman got along well with the old Taoist. Of course, it could be that they got along well. Anyway, Yenzhua had been doing a lot of business in the name of the old Taoist all these years. Xiandu Temple was a colossal entity, and its vassal states could not be counted with one hand. In addition, there were dozens of dynasties and vassal states under Xiandu Temple. Just Xiandu Temple itself had close to 100,000 Taoist officials. Chapter 954. At the border between Yongzhou and Peizhou, two female cultivators were strolling side by side as they ascended the mountain. The female cultivator's face was blurry, as if she was floating in the clouds. She was wearing a robe made of water and clouds. She was Wu Zhou, one of the few cultivators who had participated in the last Riverside meeting. Chapter 955. Located in the northernmost secret prefecture of the Qingming world, there was a lonely mountain called the Leap Moon Peak. There was a river at the foot of the mountain. The mountain was steep, the stones were like jade, and the pine trees were green. However, the spiritual energy was thin. Obviously, it was not a good place to set up a Taoist temple. The mountain and water restriction of the Leap Moon Peak was the fist aura of the martial artists. It was like a lake at the top of the mountain. The fist aura poured over the mountain like water, but it did not hurt the creatures in the mountain. Martial artists did not stop there. If the cultivators were not in the ascendant state, they should not expect to reach the top. Chapter 956. Golden Jade City, Wasteland. There was an 8-sided pavilion with a horizontal board inscribed with the words, Moon's Brow. The sky was leaking and the moon was sparse, the earth was slanted, and the wind was mixed. A middle-aged scholar wearing a green gown and a jasper crown gently clenched his fist. In his palm were 2 black and white chess pieces that creaked. Following this Golden Jade City's guest cultivators thought, strange phenomena appeared in this pavilion. The atmosphere was magnificent, but not the slightest bit of the world's spiritual energy flowed out of the pavilion. Chapter 957. The first day of spring. It was the beginning of all things, and all things were reborn. It was the beginning of the 4 seasons and the beginning of the year. When Chen Pingon returned to the demon-subduing tower from the Solar Term Institute at the peak of Sui Mountain, the Holy Master and the pure Yang Taoist were nowhere to be seen. Only Xiao Imo, who wore a yellow hat, green shoes, and a green bamboo cane, was left standing in the corridor on the top floor with Qing Tong, who was dressed in a green robe. Chapter 958. Tao Ren swallowed his saliva and mustered his courage to ask telepathically, "Are you really that person?" Sword Immortal Tao didn't dare to call him by his name. It was too ridiculous. Chen Pingon smiled and replied telepathically, "Didn't I already say it at the Phosphor River? If I'm not wrong, it's me." Sword Immortal Tao just didn't believe it. "How am I supposed to believe it? I saw a young man with 2 sabers hanging from his waist, wearing a long green robe and cloth shoes, and then he claimed to be Chen Pingon. I foolishly believed him." Chapter 959. A green gown flew out of the ancestral hall like a green waterfall, flowing from the top of the green duckweed peak to the mountain gate. Cui Dongshan cracked some sunflower seeds and smiled. "Let's postpone the meeting for a while. Let's drink some tea first." Pei Qian originally wanted to follow her master to the mountain gate to welcome Li Baoping, but the big white goose smiled and shook its head at her. Xiaobu, Tao Ran, and the other members of the ancestral hall who just came up the mountain, as well as Yi Yunyun and the other guests, naturally felt strange. They didn't know who it was that made Mountain Lord Chen Pingon go to the foot of the mountain, as if he could put aside any important matters for a while. He didn't even want to waste time talking at the ancestral hall. This wasn't like Chen Pingon's usual style. Cui Dongshan's eyes suddenly brightened. "Senior sister, I know who is the biggest contributor to our fallen mountain gate." Chapter 960. The Qingping Sword Sex Landscape Bulletin was placed at Steaming Cloud Mountain, and Zhong Qiu was in charge of it. Cui Dongshan placed the Catoptric Deflection Bulletin on Mount Xinyao instead of Ancestral Mountain, which had the best scenery, or Steaming Cloud Mountain, which was closest to the ferry. It was unexpected but reasonable. Celestial Capital Mountain was a place for sword cultivators, while Steaming Cloud Mountain was a place for martial artists to learn fist techniques. Both were very pure. Cui Dongshan laughed. "Mr. Zhong, you are the accountant. Why don't you flip through the account books so that the elders of the upper sex, including me, can know what to do?" He wanted to say it out loud so that everyone would be happy. Chapter 961. The old elementary scholar stepped over the threshold and waved his hand, indicating that there was no need to change seats. The old elementary scholar sat on the bench beside Cui Dongshan. Cui Dongshan's lips moved slightly, probably because he was unable to call out founder. Chen Pingon took out a jar of wine and a set of 12 flower deity wine cups. These were the items that he had stolen from the Confucian temple. He asked Xiaomi to help him distribute the wine cups and pour the wine. The old elementary scholar took the wine cups and Xiaomi poured the wine for Old Master Wensheng. She then placed the wine jar on the bench beside Old Master Wensheng. The old elementary scholar suddenly remembered something and took out a large stack of red envelopes from his sleeves. Each red envelope contained 2 pieces of snow money. The amount of money was not much, but the words on the red envelopes were written not long ago. They were written by the old elementary scholar before he left the Merit Forest. Therefore, the old elementary scholar handed the red envelopes to Xiaomi and reminded her with a smile, "Xiaomi, don't throw these red envelopes away. They're only worth a little money, and they are rare. If you need money in the future, go to the Aquarius Continent's Lakeview Academy or the Shunho sect and find a buyer who knows their stuff. If the price is less than 2 pieces of snow money, don't sell them." You're tuning in to the Mystic Fist YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.